Welcome to The Vital Point. I'm your host, Jonathan Schechter. If you are interested in transformational work such as plant medicine, psychedelics, breath work, meditation, somatic practices, cold exposure, yoga, and more, then, my friends, you are in the right place. Welcome to The Vital Point, the podcast that is for practitioners as well as people new to transformational work looking curiously for more information and guidance. So if you are new to this type of work, welcome. I'm your host, Jonathan Schechter. I am an integration coach and breathwork facilitator. I've also been meditating for about 20 years and do some mindfulness instruction as well. So this podcast brings you leaders in the fields of transformational work, whether that's psychedelics and plant medicine work, breath work, or a myriad of other types of modalities. And my goal with this podcast is to not only introduce you to new modalities and practices, but help spark your curiosity to go out and actually practice them. So I hope you enjoy today's episode of the show. My guest on today's episode is Genny Rumancik, known on Instagram as the EQ School. Genny is an emotional intelligence and trauma worker, facilitator, educator, and the founder of the EQ School, where she teaches emotional intelligence, regulation, healing from trauma, and relational development. So I really like this episode. We get into some cool stuff like how the stories that we tell ourselves are actually running our lives and what we can do to start to overcome that and build emotional intelligence. So hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to another episode of The Vital Point. My name is Jonathan Schechter, and this podcast is for you if you are interested in transformational practices, curious about starting new ones, or a practitioner of these different types of practices, psychedelic work, breath work, hypnotherapy, all these wonderful modalities that we have. And so today I'm really excited about our guest because I feel like what her work and the work that she posts about is something that we come to within the transformational practice. Like, not necessarily like you might not go into a plant medicine ceremony like specifically saying, I need emotional regulation, but at some point you're going to come across the need for it and do some work around it as part of your journey. So Jen Rumancik, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you here. So Jen is the owner of the EQ School, where she teaches online workshops in emotional intelligence, emotional regulation, healing trauma, and relational development. Did I cover it there?
Yeah, it's kind of all over the map. Yeah.
Cool. So how did you get started with that work?
It's funny. It's been a long time in the making. So I guess the story starts with I grew up in a family that had a lot of chaos, and so then as I moved into adulthood, I've been doing therapy and personal growth work and like that, all of that always on the side. And then professionally, I started my career as an educator, as a high school teacher. I moved into tech, and then I actually moved into advertising and went to a graduate program that looked at not only like how do we be creative, how do we do good work, how do we look to the future and be innovative, but it was like how do we embrace our whole selves as a part of that. So how do you see how your blind spots impact the work that you're doing? How do you get into healthy conflict with other people like in this process, because that's where we do actually really, really good and important work, is by like learning how to be in difficult conversations with other people. So in that program, I got way more out of that side of it, which is like, how do I actually understand who I am, like what do I bring to all of my experiences in the world, and how do I create space for other people's, and how do we talk about that in relation to the professional world, because it's all interrelated. And that was the first time that I'd really had that like laid out, is like, no, yeah, it's okay to talk about who you are, like in the workplace and these types of things. And so that paved the way for me to create this program, which is helping people develop emotional intelligence, which is knowing and understanding yourself and your background and your triggers and your values and what motivates you. And then going forward, how do you take that information and learn how to like bring it into your life? How do you understand how your life experiences impact your life for better and for worse, and make choices that can help you like manage that? Because life, I've said this to someone recently, is like, life is just a series of good and bad experiences. And so if you don't learn how to navigate those emotionally, like, you're gonna have a real hard time. So
yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good segue into kind of what I wanted to talk about on this episode. You said life is a series of good and bad events, and it's how we process them, right? And that's been so there's been these posts that you've had recently that have just so clearly resonated with me, and they're basically about two different things. One of them is like about the stories and the narratives that we're telling ourselves. So like, I guess in a way you could say the difference between how we experience those events in our lives has a lot to do with the stories that we tell ourselves about it, and the stories that our body is telling us based on our past experiences.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
So like, I'd love to get a little bit more into that. And then, sort of as like a second part of it, the part where I was like, oh my God, this is just speaking to me so clearly, was a post recently where you said, the reason you're struggling to do the work to change is because the habits that aren't serving you anymore are still bringing you comfort in some way by meeting a need. And again, going back to like those narratives that we tell ourselves, and like, the reason that I think that emotional intelligence work is so important is because we come to transformational work for a reason, right? Like, we're either trying to heal something or we're trying to develop ourselves authentically. And inevitably we run into roadblocks, and there's frustration, and like, why can't I make these changes actually stick? And to me, a huge unlock of that is like, well, it's because of the stories that we're telling ourselves and the state of our nervous system as we try to make changes in our life, as we try to expand.
100%.
And so like your content was just like, oh yes, it just completely speaks to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, in regard to stories, I mean, humans are just narrative creatures. Everything is a story. I mean, just even look at, coming from advertising, like, everything is crafted into a narrative that we can relate to in some way, shape, or form. And just as humans, we always fill in the context with our own experience. So we do a really interesting exercise in that in one of my workshops that shows you, like, with very little information, you're going to create a full story in your mind about what something means. And so part of this work that I help people with is developing self-awareness about what are you filling in there? Like, how does your past experience, what are you adding to the story? Because when you start to be able to see that, like, oh, I'm adding this, and that's not maybe the actual truth of the situation, you can put some space between what's actually happening, and like how you feel and like who you are. And so when we could put space in it, then we create space for change, for other things to happen. But if your story is just like, I'm bad because X, Y, and Z, like, if you're so wrapped up in it and your feelings are so tied to it, it's really hard to create that space for actual change to happen. So being able to, like, be in constant relationship with your stories and to recognize, like, what lens am I adding to this, can be a really helpful tool for changing.
Yeah, definitely. So like, what would be one way that people can start to develop that kind of awareness around the stories that they're telling themselves?
Well, I even just have everybody start with, like, looking at all the big cultural narratives that have influenced us. So, I mean, one of the simple ones that we hear talked about all the time is like gender roles. And it's like, what were we told about what women need to be and what men need to be? And how has that influenced your life? And it has. And so from these big stories too that are created, then we have rules too, like these rules that determine like what we're supposed to be doing. And if we break the rule, we end up having like really, really bad feelings about it oftentimes, or feelings of shame, or feelings of like, I'm a disappointment now because I'm not following this rule from this greater story. So I think
Right.
the easiest place to start is starting to look at like the bigger, higher cultural ones that we've all been following. And then from there, we can get in closer and closer and realize like, I mean, even stories about like, you know, to get respect, you have to earn it. Like that's a story too. Like, and that there are a lot of things like that that affect us deeply. That it's like, well, I haven't earned this, so no one, I don't deserve people's respect. And it's like that's a story. That's not true. Like as a human being, you absolutely deserve to be respected for who you are. So
Yeah.
we just kind of start to look at all of them and then piece them apart and see like what are some of the rules that come out of that end up making you feel, you know, that end up in affecting you emotionally in a big and important way.
I love like how the story can be, it's so relative, right? Like two different people can experience the same event and process it and experience it completely differently. And like one person, it could really drag them down, you know, and get them into some sort of personal quagmire. Another person, it's like going to help them rise, you know. And so like you know, within my work, it's so important just acknowledging that element of how we experience our life through stories, and then also just reminding people like we have the power to change that narrative, and like within that change and within that perspective shift is a lot of the, you know, a lot of what you're looking for, because you can take this tragedy and turn it into a triumph. You know, you have the ability to like reframe those stories and like actually create strength and create purpose. So many of the people that I know, like in the healing and transformational space, are there because of their own stories. You know, like of turning those that adversity into something that's a strength and into something that they want to help share with others, because it's like, oh man, like once you kind of get out of that swamp, you just want to help other people, like, you know, extend your hand.
Yeah. Well, and another place that I love to have people start too is by doing work around like identifying your values and what's really important to you, and then doing work around just paying attention to what gives you energy and what takes energy from you. And so becoming more connected with your body, because so many of us have been taught, you know, to be externally focused on what's going on with everyone else and to be good and whatever. And that means we've created this disconnect between our own, like, paying attention to what's working for us and what isn't. And some of those, it's just funny what comes out of some of those, some people experience within that, because you're just like, whoa, I didn't realize that that kind of thing affected me so deeply, and it's just a little part of my day. And like learning how to actually be in connection with yourself and with your body is really, really big and important. And many of us get away from that.
Yeah, definitely. So like what would be like a method that you work with your clients on in terms of building that awareness and staying within your body? Is there any specific practice you could share?
Well, one of the exercises is just tracking. It's like tracking throughout the week, and we have like a sheet, and you check and you look, and you, after everything you do, you just like do a body scan, and it's like, did that give me energy or take it away? And just like starting to just make it a regular practice, make it more of a habit to check in and see what's going on, and scanning, where's their tension, like what's going on here, and just noticing, because noticing is just such a big part of this. Because we want to go into overanalyzing and overthinking and whatever first, and it's like first is just presence,
Right.
just being present with yourself and seeing what's there without judgment. And that's a hard part too, because whenever we're starting, people are always like, oh, but I should be doing this and I should be doing that, and it's like there's no judgment around it. And so this is going back to the other post you liked. It's like everything that we do, the habits that we have, we do because they meet a need of ours in some way, shape, or form, especially if they're things that we do a lot. It's like there's something that we learned that meet a need for us. And so don't judge yourself for that. It's like we're highly adaptable creatures. And so we've learned how to do things to meet needs, whether it is to calm our nervous system, whether it's to feel safe. And it might not be serving you anymore. It's not serving you anymore. And you can see that now, but you couldn't see that at one point. And that's okay. But that's the like letting go of some of the judgment around it is going to actually help you move through it too.
we're all doing the best we can at the time. We can't punish ourselves for not knowing what we didn't know back then. It's just a matter of like, hey, now that I see this, I have the sovereignty to change it. It's my accountability. It's my responsibility to then take control of that and work to change it.
Yeah. Well, and one thing from the post that you mentioned too, or maybe one of the other recent ones, is that two needs that I think are important to mention are that we all have a need for certainty and like stability in some way, shape, and form, and we all have a need for significance, like feeling important in some way, shape, or form. So, because some people might ask, like, well, if I'm always telling myself these stories that beat myself up, like, what purpose does that serve? Like, what need is that serving? And the need that it serves is often significance. It's often that if I'm the only one who doesn't have what I want, if I'm the worst person at this, I'm significant in some way. And so that gives you a sense of being important.
Yeah.
But it's not, but when you could realize like, oh, I'm doing that because it like gives me a sense of self and who I am and ownership in this world. But it's like, but that's not the one that I want. So maybe I need to rewrite the story and start telling a different one that helps me feel important in a different way.
Yeah, for me, like in my journey, like I discovered how much of a story that I had around having to be busy, having to basically prove myself by providing some sort of value all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And like who am I when I'm not doing that? And a lot of the inquiry and the awareness into doing that work was becoming aware of like how overbearing my inner critic was. Like how much that part of me was just like front and center, driving the bus, in charge of everything. And this one day I just said, well, what would happen if I like let that part know that it can sit in the back for a while? And I had such good intentions for that. It seemed so innocent. And what I really discovered was like that the role that inner critic was playing in the stories that I tell myself, in that like you have to be doing something all the time, otherwise people aren't going to love you.
Yeah.
Otherwise people are going to leave you, and like that inner critic was doing that job of like, hey, let's stay busy. We want to stay lovable. We want people to care about us. So it's like it's a very I think sometimes it's a complicated thing to kind of unravel like what those parts are, what the what needs are actually needing to be served.
Yeah.
And being able to like sit with that uncomfortability.
Yeah. And the way that we look at it with like significance and certainty is like they are needs that need to be served. But if we prioritize especially those two over everything else, we're going to be unhappy. And so it's like we do need to feel important, and we can find other ways that are in alignment with our values. So that's why I start with like what gives you energy and what do you value and what's important to you, because then we can keep redirecting back to, like an example I give is gossiping. Like people who gossip and like catch themselves in it and feel bad about it. And it's like, well, why do you do that? You probably do that to feel important in some way and to connect with other people. And it's like, okay, if you can understand the core of it is like, I want to feel like seen and important and like have important information. And I also want to connect with people. It's like, well, you can find different ways to connect with people. Maybe we could work on finding a different way for you to feel significant and seen with people. But when we can understand like, I'm doing this thing, but what is it doing for me? It can help us kind of figure out and feel less guilty too, I think, about why we're doing it. And it's like, okay, I can give myself a break here and see what else is possible.
Yeah, I love that practice of just starting with the awareness. It's so funny how that just snowballs into so many other things. Like even with the mundane, right? Like there's that old cliche of like, if you think about like a particular color car, you start seeing it everywhere. And so, yeah, just the same thing, like we're bringing awareness to these parts of ourselves, and then that just opens up to so much more and continues to open up.
And to that point of the car thing, it's like, that's why it's also really important that we tell different stories, or stories that serve us and are in alignment with like who we actually want to be, and looking at like, because if we're looking for evidence that we are bad, lazy, whatever, we're gonna find it. we're gonna turn things. We're gonna take that story and like make sure that we see it. So it's just like such a good point of we do see what we look for.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up in terms of like creating a story of who we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's such an important point, is like we don't have to be imprisoned by those stories. Now, it's an oversimplification to say like, cool, I can just change the narrative in my head and reality is just going to flow along with that. But that's the reason that like I always tell people like start with a mindfulness practice, because if you can bring mindfulness and awareness of what's happening in your body and your mind into your daily life, a lot of the noise, a lot of the chatter is going to fall away. Mm-hmm. And what's going to be left is like the nervous system stuff, those narratives that really do need to be addressed before the change can actually take effect and grow and start to, the story can change into this person of like who you want to be.
Yeah. And many of our stories that like really deeply hurt us too, just like aren't true. Because oftentimes when they really hurt and they're ongoing and they're like the underlying core of everything, they're usually connected to our worth in some way, like that I'm just not good enough and I can't have this thing. And that's just inherently not true. Like, you're not unworthy of love. You're not inherently broken. Like, those things just cannot be true. And when we can finally, at least intellectually, start to recognize that, and then we notice when that story comes up, at least we can start like pushing it away, putting distance between the story and who we are, and being able to like, yes, that's a story and it's coming up, and no, I don't have to believe it right now, and then go into the emotional spiral that it usually brings. And that's in my emotional self-management workshop. We do a lot of work in looking at stories and teasing out stories and the rules that come from our stories. And then we go into looking at our emotional patterning, because we all have emotional places that we go. And so coming back to our stories, and because we are creatures of habit, we go into places where we go to emotions quickly, and we go to stories that are tied to that emotion quickly, and we can stay stuck in this kind of spiral in that emotional place. And so the better we get at recognizing and being aware of where do I tend to go and what do I tend to do and what does it tend to look like, we can start like wedging in like, okay, I know what this is, okay, is this what I want to do right now? And sometimes you're still going to do it. But the awareness, like you said, developing the awareness first is eventually you're going to get to a point to be like, I know where this leads and this isn't what I want to do right now. So I need to figure out something else. But if we don't have the awareness of what our patterns are, then it's really hard to break them.
Yeah. Sherilyn Sunshine said something about kind of like not living in the past, right? So like those stories are sort of like programs running in the background, triggering us in these different ways until we can actually like have awareness of them and work through them emotionally, so that they're not running, in the background anymore. Like, oh, okay, I have this pattern, or I have this story based on this past experience. And I think that's one of those fun things about human nature, right? Is like a lot of the stories that we have told ourselves come from this time in our life where we were so young that we didn't really have the cognitive hardware to like understand that the meaning that we were making out of these events really is not the only reality.
Yeah.
When we're children, we're so self-absorbed to a certain extent because we don't have like empathy and awareness that the world doesn't, that we don't have that awareness that the world's not revolving around us. And at some point that's going to be disappointed. And then like, how we interpret that, how we process that really has a huge effect on like other things down the road.
And that's, it's not until about the age, somewhere between 4 and 5 for most children is when they start to develop, you start to realize like, I'm not the center of everybody's universe. Like, oh, they're the center of their own universe. Is like, and that's a good 4 or 5 years is a long time. So if before that, if you had parents if you lost a parent or your parents got divorced, or even like having parents who had to work a lot who couldn't be around, like before that, you probably interpreted that as like, it's something about me that people couldn't meet my needs. And so that's the other thing about stories is like the earlier that they happened and the more emotionally significant that they were, the harder it is to see that it's a story and not an actual truth. And so it can be real tough to see that like this isn't just the truth. This is like just a thing that happened when I was so young, and I was like, my brain was developing so quickly that I just internalized it.
Yeah. There was during my breathwork facilitator training, we did a lot of this fractal psychology work, and there was this really moving section to me where we talked about like, being if basically like if you had brothers and sisters, no matter how great of a life you had, no matter how much your parents provided for you physically, emotionally, mentally, all those things, like you can't help but feel betrayed and feel abandoned and feel like lost at some point, because you literally went from the situation where you were the center of the universe to now you have to share the spotlight with somebody else. And how dare that person take that attention and that love away from you? And this is like, this is your brothers or your sisters, like your family. And like, of course, as an adult, you would never like look at it that way.
Yeah.
But we have this imprint, of this experience of like, well, wait, now what happened to this love?
Yeah.
And it's such a powerful example of like how these small things can really have big impacts on us.
Well, there's two things. I want to get to Louise's comment in a second, but I also, to that point, I also want to say that, like, for parents, it's so important that children do experience adversity. It is a part of developing as a human, because coming back to that earlier statement of like life is good experiences and bad experiences. And if we don't learn tools for resiliency and not just adapting so that we don't actually like, process the emotion and move through it, but we have to learn how to become resilient to things, and that's a parent's job to like allow a child to experience it but support them through it and help them actually learn how to feel their feelings, and that it's okay for them, it's okay for us to experience adversity, and it's when we don't actually move through the emotion and when we don't process it, that's when it stays with us for such a long time, when we make it about who we are. But one thing Louise said is, she said, stories connected to specific emotions can cheat. You believe that they're proof of the validity of the emotion. And I think that's a good point, too, that, like, the whole idea of, like, valid emotions and invalid emotions being, like, just not, like, get that out of your head, because all emotions are valid, because emotions are just, like, response to stimuli. Like, we just have emotional reactions and we have them all the time. And so it's not like some are okay and some aren't, because our emotions are just trying to give us information and tell us like whether we're in danger or whether a need is being met. And I think this is what you're getting at, Louise, is that if we've experienced trauma, sometimes our emotions are telling us that things aren't safe or that things aren't okay, when they actually probably are. But and this is coming back to why it's so important to understand how our experiences shape our experiences or our reactions to the world. And so it's not that your emotions are invalid. It's just like the story that might be coming up with the emotion just needs to be looked at. You need to look at what is your need beneath what you're feeling. And that's a practice. And it's a practice that can be developed. Does that make sense?
Definitely made sense to me. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, it's like having awareness that there's no inherent meaning behind anything. It's just the meaning that we assign to it.
Yeah.
And different people are going to assign different meanings and different stories depending on their life experience, depending on the stories that they experienced previously, depending on their upbringing, and so many other factors. Like I think that's one of the amazing things about this transformational work is like seeing the different layers that build into those stories. The generational trauma, the cultural stories, like you said, the things, like going back and looking at what were my grandparents like, and what were my great grandparents like, what were their parents like, and like actually putting myself in their situation of like, wow, what kind of stories did they experience and then pass on through my lineage? So there's so many different layers and levels to uncover, but really, to kind of boil it down, I would say coming back into that awareness getting still and being just aware of like what those stories are and how you're feeling. Like you said, like tapping into, does this make me feel good or does this make me feel depleted? You know, and starting from there, knowing that we have the ability to rewrite those stories and change those narratives. Do you think I got that right?
Yeah, and it does take some effort and it takes some time.
Definitely.
But it's definitely possible. And that's a story that you have to switch. It's possible for me to get better at this. Because a lot of people will just think I'm broken and think certain things happen to me and I'm not going to be able to do this. But the beautiful thing is like all of this, the data and the science that we're finding is that you can heal your nervous system. You can actually change and come back if you've experienced big trauma, even in very early parts of your life. So,
do you think it's helpful to leave yourself reminders of like those reframing narratives, like in places? Like you just said, you know, you like, I am worthy, like, you know, things like that, like things that you're working on, like just to remind you and like sort of insert those little director's notes, let's say, into your story.
This is one of those things that I'm like, everyone is so different in what helps them. And so sometimes it might be like someone who reminds you. I know I've gone through phases where I put up notes and then I just don't even see them.
Right.
You know, after like 2 days. So I think it's like, and this is why in all of my workshops I do so much work around like becoming self-aware of what works for you, because it's going to be different for all of us. And that's also why like, and I get reminded by this from my students often, is like, there's no one way, and that's okay. Yeah. Like you might come in and find a couple of these things don't resonate with you, but that's why we try a bunch of different ones to see like, well, what sticks and what actually feels like it's moving the needle for you. So that is one way that I know does help a lot of people, is making notes and writing things and visually, because it also depends on the type of learner I think we are too. It's like, how do we take in things, you know, auditorily or visually, but I think it's a good idea. Yes.
Well, I think that's such a great point, just to kind of like put a bow on it, of the most important practices are the ones that work for you. And that's kind of like the point, that's the vital point to me, is like, you've got to go and practice. Like you got to go and figure out the things that work for you, because not everything's going to work for you. And it's all about like finding those practices that resonate. And some, you know, even the things that work for you or the things that you align with, like you just mentioned, might change through your life and through your process, you know, like, so just having those different resources, having those different tools, and being curious, you know, to go out and try new things. So I think that's a good segue into kind of wrapping this up. So where can people find out more about your work, or, you know, go to work with you to learn this emotional intelligence?
Yeah, well, my website is www.theeqschool.co, but you can find it all on my Instagram in my link in the bio there. But I teach live workshops that are like 4 or 5 weeks long, and then I also have online courses that you can go through. To work
awesome
emotional intelligence. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jen, for sharing your experience and your work with us today. I hope it inspires the people listening to check you out, or at the very least, like get in and learn more about emotional intelligence, and just really start to unpack those narratives that they're telling themselves. It's a very worthwhile practice. It's something that's definitely been a huge part of my journey. So I really appreciate your time and your knowledge here today.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun to chat with you about it.
Yeah, and thank you so much to the people in the live, your comments and your questions. Definitely keep those coming for future episodes. I love the interactivity. That's kind of why I wanted to do this podcast on IG Live rather than just like recording it on Zoom and uploading it. So yeah, with that said, thank you guys so much for joining. And if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, please subscribe and leave reviews. They definitely help. And follow the EQ School and Blue Magic Alchemy on Instagram for more information on transformational practice. So thanks everybody for joining today. Thanks for checking out another episode of the podcast. I hope that you not only enjoyed it, but that you feel inspired to go and do some practice of your own. You know, whether that is something that is a part of your regular routine, like meditation or breath work, or trying something new like taking an ice bath or starting a new mindset practice. Maybe you feel curious to something that you've been called to try, working with a new teacher, a new facilitator, or maybe even working with psychedelics or plant medicine in whatever way is safe and legal for you where you live. My hope is that you are curious and continue to expand your transformational practice, and that this podcast inspires you to continue doing that. As always, if you can follow or subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it on, it definitely helps. And if you can leave a review, even just a few reviews really help to push the podcast up in the algorithm and help make it more visible to more people. I'd love it if you shared it with your friends if you're finding it valuable or interesting. As always, follow me at Blue Magic Alchemy on Instagram, all one word. And if you're interested in learning more about breathwork, or you'd like support integrating or preparing for self-development and transformational practice, reach out to me at bluemagicalchemy@gmail.com or at Instagram to set up a discovery call for Instagram coaching. Until next time, thank you, be well, and keep practicing. That's the vital point.